Well, I'll speak on behalf of Michael. We're both delighted to be here. We're both huge fans of Lumen Christi, and this year in particular, we've had more of an opportunity to come to Chicago to Lumen Christi events. But once we move back to Philadelphia, we hope to be returning as well. Can you hear me? Am I speaking too softly? If I start to speak too softly, just kind of raise your hand because I have a cold today, so I might start to speak softly. Okay. So I have been through this document, read this document twice. It's 268 pages, takes a long time. And I'm going to just make 2 points this afternoon. And then I don't actually know what Michael's going to do.
And she wouldn't let me look at her remarks either, so which is why I'm going to be taking notes to respond.
My 2 points. The first has to do with twin concerns of Pope Francis's that emerge, I think, on every page of this document, but also emerge very strongly in Evangelii Gaudium and Laudato Si, and I think it's the marker of this, one of the markers of this pontificate. And then my second reflection is going to be, I'm going to talk about a typology of images that I see running throughout this document, and I think that it exhibits one of the ways that Pope Francis thinks about things, and I think it's an important set of images to highlight in order to understand kind of how he approaches this apostolic exhortation. I'm going to be staying away from chapter 8. Mike might not do that, but I'm happy to talk about the more kind of contentious questions over our conversation after our initial comments. Okay, so the twin concerns. Pope Francis is very, sort of comes from the heart, has an evangelical zeal. He's committed to proclaiming the good news of the gospel. It's alive, it's pertinent, it's attractive. He wants to make it attractive in particular to young people, doesn't think it's been made attractive to young people enough. So he wants to be an evangelizer of the gospel, proclaiming the good news on the one hand. On the other hand, he has a deep realism. He's a realist about the challenges of modern life and about what that's going to mean. What does it mean to proclaim the good news of the gospel given the context of married life in our modern era? So there's both an attraction of the gospel and a recognition that the contemporary home is the locus of profound suffering. I'm going to take an example from chapter 1, where he juxtaposes an allusion or a reference to a poem by Jorge Luis Borges, an Argentine poet of the last century, called Calle Desconocida. He juxtaposes this poem with Psalm 128. And this emerges out of a reference of Matthew 7. And let me read where this juxtaposition emerges in chapter 1. I'm quoting the document. Jesus' description of the two houses, one built on rock and the other on sand, symbolizes any number of family situations shaped by the exercise of their members' freedom. For as the poet says, this is Borges, as the poet says, every home is a lampstand. Now, whoever translated this apostolic exhortation should have written every home is a candelabra. This is going to become clear why candelabra is a better translation than lampstand in just a minute. So we've got Matthew 7. Houses can be built either on sand or on rock. And this poet, I'm going to turn to this poet, to this poem for a second, and I'm going to recite the last stanza of this poem. The narrator in Calle Desconocida is walking along the streets of Buenos Aires, and he comes upon a street that he had recognized from his childhood, and kind of vaguely recognizes it. And this is the last stanza when he reflects about this experience. And he writes, I'll read it first in Spanish for any Spanish speakers here, and then I'll read it, I think, twice in English, so we can focus on the images. Solo después reflexioné que aquella calle de la tarde era ajena, que toda casa es un candelabro, donde las vidas de los hombres arden, como velas aisladas, que todo inmediato paso nuestro camina sobre Gólgotas. I'll translate. And only afterwards I realized that place was strange, that every house is a candelabra, where the lives burn each in its separate flame, that each of our unthinking footsteps makes its way over the Golgothas of others. Let me read it one more time so with the images sink in. And only afterwards I realized that place was strange. This is the street that he had been walking on. That every house is a candelabra, where the lives burn each in its separate flame, that each of our unthinking footsteps makes its way over the Golgothas of others. What's Golgotha? What happened in Golgotha? Good, thanks. Just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page there. Okay. So the house is a candelabra where each life burns in a separate flame, and to walk among these houses is to tread over the secret sufferings of others. So this is a realist depiction of modern family life if I've ever heard one. This is juxtaposed then, what the document turns to then is Psalm 128 that's read in many Jewish and Christian liturgies. And I'll read the psalm that is quoted actually in the document. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. You shall eat the fruit of the labor of your hands. You shall be happy, and it shall go well with you. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your children will be like olive shoots round your table. Thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. The Lord bless you from Zion. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. May you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. So there's this twin concern to proclaim the gospel, and yet a recognition of the real brokenness of family life, human lives. It's a marker of the papacy, and I think you see it on every page of this document. He quotes in this chapter that the fruitful love of marriage becomes a symbol of God's inner life. That's what he wants to proclaim, that the fruitful love of marriage becomes a symbol of God's inner life. But also, and here I'll quote from the document, but also, the thread of suffering and bloodshed in family life runs through numerous pages of the Bible, beginning with Cain's murder of his brother Abel. We read of the disputes between the sons and wives of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the tragedies and violence marking the family of David, the family problems reflected in the story of Tobias, and the bitter complaint of Job. This is the complaint of Job that he's quoting from the book of Job. He has put my brethren far from me. My kinsfolk and my close friends have failed me. I am repulsive to my wife, loathsome to the sons of my own mother. So this realism that Pope Francis, that is in this document, is rooted in the Bible itself, right? It's out of this house of David, out of this group, this chosen people, murderers, liars, lazy folk, who do not keep the covenant, that Jesus of Nazareth walks the streets and saves humanity. Our family life is threaded with moments of joy and with moments of deep suffering. Yet the document offers us a hope that where God will wipe away every tear from our eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain. It's from the book of Revelation. I'll say in our family life, it's not group therapy yet, but in our own family life, it absolutely rings true. There are these moments, Mike and I have been married 16 years, there are these moments, we have 4 children, where we're sitting around the table during family dinner, and we usually have each of us mentions what are the rose and the thorn is of our day. That's kind of how we organize the chaos that is family dinner at home with young children, trying to get them to talk. And it's worked well. And there are moments in which we're sitting around, Tomas is talking about his rose and thorn, and I just think, wow, this is it. You're touching the joy of something. And they're not moments that you can conjure up. They're just moments that happen, right, that emerge and that you just are struck by. And yet there are other moments where there's been a lot of slamming of doors and screaming and my throat is sore, in which I think, like, what are we doing? We should all just pack up and move to separate places. There just are, right? I mean, there's just, okay, that's all I'll say about that. But the point is that both the call of the gospel and the moments of hope and joy are there in real family life. But then those flames of individual suffering are also there, threaded throughout. Okay, my second point, typology of images. Pope Francis, uses a set of images, and I actually did a word count. I love word counts. They're all organic images. He uses the word growth 46 times, the word discernment 46 times, development 35 times, process 29 times, gradualness 12, and journey 8. So these organic images of growth, discernment, development, process, gradualness, and journey are threaded throughout the document. And I think it's important because it gives us a window into how he sees the sacrament of marriage. So he says that the sacrament is a gift given for the sanctification and salvation of the spouses, since their mutual belonging is a real representation through the sacramental sign of the same relationship between Christ and the church. That's a pretty tall order. Let me read that again. That's a big deal. The sacrament is a gift given for the sanctification and salvation of the spouses, since their mutual belonging is a real representation through the sacramental sign of the same relationship between Christ and the church. The married couple are therefore a permanent reminder of the church of what took place on the cross. So it's not this rainbows and butterfly. The married couple, butterfly message. The married couple is a permanent reminder of for the church of what took place on the cross. They are for one another and for their children witnesses of the salvation in which they share through the sacrament. Marriage is a vocation, inasmuch as it is a response to a specific call to experience conjugal love as an imperfect sign of the love between Christ and the church. A lot of the times, it's that word imperfect jumps out at me. It's imperfect most of the time, right? All the time, I would say. Inasmuch as it is a response to a specific call to experience conjugal love as an imperfect sign of the love between Christ and the church. Consequently, the decision to marry and to have a family ought to be fruit of a process of vocational discernment. Fine. About 100 pages later, he recognizes, though, that at times the couple does not grasp the theological and spiritual import of the words of consent. I certainly didn't, which illuminate the meaning of all the signs that follow. It needs to be stressed that these are the words that the husband and wife say, the words of consent at the sacrament of matrimony. These words cannot be reduced to the present day. They involve a totality that includes the future, until death do us part. So on the altar 16 years ago, when Mike and I were married, the words that we each said, the words of consent that we said to each other, changed each of us ontologically forever. We were forever became the husband and wife who consented to be married indissolubly, right? We didn't know what that meant. If we had known what that meant, I don't know that we would have done it. I mean, really. Like, I'm not kidding here. You know, it was all, things were going to go great all the time, right? I had no idea. We almost moved to Iowa at one point, remember? I didn't know that the words of consent meant moving to Des Moines. I hadn't thought of that. You know, if that had been, I don't know. Anyway, it's important. So part of the insights of this document is those words change you forever, permanently, ultimately. I am a different person because of those words that I said on that altar. And yet I had no idea what those words meant. And the coming to live into those words, to understand those words, it is an organic development. It's a development that takes hold of you and it grows throughout life. That's why I think these organic images are threaded throughout the gospel. And I'll end with one that I think that I'm particularly drawn to in this. I think this is chapter 5, maybe. The image of wine. Have you ever been at a party or a dinner or something where you taste wine at the beginning and you don't think it's that good, and then somebody who knows a lot more about wine than you do says, give it a minute, and then you give it like a half hour and you taste it again, and it tastes radically different and much better and deeper and sweeter and complex, and I don't know anything about wines, but I've had that experience. Okay, from the document. A word should be said about those whose love, like a fine wine, has come into its own. Just as a good wine begins to breathe with time, so too the daily experience of fidelity gives married life richness and body. Its joys and sacrifices bear fruit as the years go by and the couple rejoices to see their children's children. The love present from the beginning becomes more conscious, settled, and mature as the couple discover each other anew day after day, year after year. St. John of the Cross tells us that old lovers are tried and true. They are outwardly no longer afire with powerful emotions and impulses, but now taste the sweetness of the wine of love, well aged and stored deep within their hearts. Such couples have successfully overcome crises and hardships without fleeing from challenges or concealing problems. So you notice that even in that paragraph, we've got this beautiful image of this wine that's growing over time, and yet the last line in the paragraph admits that the way that the wine ages is through trials and suffering together. So to conclude, there are contentious elements of this document, and like most papal documents, it's got everything but the kitchen sink, and there are moments in which you think, like, why did you write that? But I do think its strength is that at the end of those 268 pages, it makes you want to be a better husband, or a better wife, or a better mother, or a better father. It makes you want to be better. So Mike's gonna put Mike a little uncomfortable here, but he quotes this poem from Mario Benedetti, who's a Uruguayan poet. And this poem is quoted, I think, toward the end of the document in full in one of the footnotes. He's a Uruguayan poet who died, I think, in 2009. And he writes this poem, Te quiero. Again, I'll read it in Spanish and then in English, but I'll just read it once because I don't need to make a lot of points about it. Okay. Te quiero. Tus manos son mis caricias, mis acordes cotidianos. I can't get through it. Okay. Sorry. I didn't know this was going to be a bad idea. Okay. Te quiero porque tus manos trabajan por la justicia. Si te quiero es porque sos mi amor, mi cómplice y todo. En la calle, codo a codo, somos mucho más que dos. Okay. It's easier to read in English because it sounds tackier. So I don't think I'll get emotional in the English. Okay. Your hands are my caress, the harmony that fills my days. I love you because your hands work for justice. If I love you, it is because you are my love, my companion, and my all. And on the street, side by side, we are much more than just two. Okay, that's it. Sorry. Wait, I'll just tell you this quick story. I had to give a presentation. I had to introduce a conference that I ran in honor of my doctoral advisor back in Boston College. And Mike knew that I was going to do the introduction. And I'm from Argentina. And before I went up, Mike grabbed my arm and he said, "Anna, anything you do, don't cry." Because he knows. I didn't expect this one, but. And I didn't. I did. I mean, I didn't follow his advice. I just couldn't. Okay, so.
Thank you.
Did you take a lot of notes?
Thank you to Thomas Levergood and the staff of Lumen Christi for inviting us to do this event on this great document of Pope Francis. And Anna did say, as we were preparing for this, that that part of the purpose here, part of the charge was to be kind of personal and to be kind of emotional. The whole point of having a married couple do this event was to sort of show a kind of emotional engagement with this document about marriage. And I'm from Minnesota, though, so we don't. I do not come from an emotional people.
I think we checked the emotional box already. I think we got that
That's why
taken care of.
it's one of the reasons we're a great pair is that Anna's from Argentina and I'm from Minnesota, and so things kind of balance out. But I want to make a few points about this document, and then, of course, I think the richest part of our afternoon will be having a conversation about parts of the document, maybe for those of you who've read it, that we haven't touched on, and otherwise just things that people are curious or wondering about. First thing I want to point out, there's been, of course, a lot of controversy in the run-up to the issuance of the document, and I think that a lot of the media attention and commentary about it highlighted the kind of contentiousness with which some of the issues were engaged. But I want to make a point about how much this is very much a piece of a longer tradition in papal encyclicals and other writings. This is an Apostolic Exhortation about the family, right? I mean, the family has been a recurrent theme of papal social teaching. Going all the way back to the fountainhead of this, at least this part of the tradition, in Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum in 1891, which has a rich, extended discussion of the importance of the family. That continues in other social encyclicals. It continues in the Council's apostolic, the Gaudium et Spes, the central document of Vatican II. And I want to just talk a little bit about why that is. Why is the family such an important piece of this part of the social doctrine of the Church? And I think there are a few reasons for that, and we couldn't do justice to all of them. But I think a few are, first of all, that there's an insistence that the family is a pre-political institution, that the family is not a creature of the state, that the family is a natural form of human association, that one has that there are rights that attach to that institution that are not merely at the sufferance of the state. And again, that's something that goes all the way back to Leo XIII in 1891, and really even before then in the doctrine of the Church. And I think that's an important message, especially in our contemporary environment, to hear that this is something that's taken with such immense seriousness in the social teaching of the Church, that it's not merely one thing among lots of others that the social teaching of the Church is addressing. So it's not like there's economic justice and political rights and all that, and then the family happens to be one among others. No, the family really is, I think, at the center of much of this social doctrine, and you get a sense of this, I think, in this document by the ways in which Pope Francis emphasizes, in particular, the biblical, I use the word kind of metaphysical and sacramental character of the family. There are extended discussions of passages of Scripture that have to do with family, both from the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's an extended discussion of what, in the metaphysical may not be quite the right label for it, but a discussion of the natural ordering toward family. There's extended discussion about sexuality, as you might expect, and what the larger meaning of conjugal love is. And there's even quite interesting and moving passages about erotic love and sexual desire in a way that Leo XIII in 1891 didn't talk about. but in the contemporary environment, Pope Francis is very much, and this is really, in some ways, he's building on, in this respect at least, Benedict XVI's encyclical on love, Deus Caritas Est, which also had a discussion of different kinds of love and really grappled with the place of erotic love in human nature and how the Church understands that. And so there's that. And then, as I say, there's also extended discussion of the sacramental, as you might expect, aspects of the family as well. Not only the sacrament of matrimony, but the importance of, for instance, the fact that the couple are the ministers of the sacrament to each other in the teaching of the Church, that talking about baptism and the call of baptism and how it flourishes in the sacrament of matrimony. And so there's I think there's a really rich discussion in some of those passages, which I encourage you to spend time with it as you read through the document on those aspects of the family. And then also the family as a place. There's a beautiful paragraph. It's all on my iPad with scribbled notes on my iPad. But the beautiful discussion at one point about the family as the place of socialization. That it's not just that the family is kind of this closed-in unit, but that also it's the place in which it's the institution through which not only the spouses but then the children in the family are socialized into the human family, and also, of course, centrally the place of the family in forming the faith of children, right? And so, over and over again, I think it's worthwhile, before one gets to the kind of contentious issues that have been so much a focus of people's discussion of this document, to look at it as part of, I think, this very rich and profound tradition that the church has in thinking about family life in these ways. So that's again the kind of larger tradition, the family in Catholic social thought. The second point I want to make is a bit about kind of the nature of an apostolic exhortation issuing from a synod of the bishops. And I was thinking about this especially in light of one of Francis's predecessors, Paul VI. So I taught this semester a seminar on Catholic social thought and law at Notre Dame. And for the last meeting of it, I had Alistair McIntyre come and talk with the students about Paul VI's encyclical Popular Progressio, which was a document about international development and sort of the world economic crisis as he perceived it in 1967, and has only become more and more acute ever since. But I was thinking about that because of the way in which, I mean, if you kind of pair up a few documents from Paul VI in the 1960s, right around the time of the closing of the council. So in 1965, he issues Apostolica Solicitudo, which is the document that establishes the Synod of Bishops, right? And the Synod of Bishops, for those unfamiliar with the concept, was an insistence by Paul VI, just as the council was closing, that he wanted to have a forum for the Pope to engage with the bishops around the world, a representative body of the bishops, on issues of particular concern, and not just, in other words, to have, I mean, the council itself was this grand international event with all the bishops assembled deliberating about the teaching of the church and the role of the church in the modern world and such, but to have a kind of ongoing forum from which the College of Bishops and the Pope at their head could deliberate about issues of particular concern. And so he issues that document in 1965, and of course this Synod of Bishops on the family is a continuance of that synodal process, which is meant to be kind of engaged in, as he says at the outset of that document in 1965, the signs of the times, which is a phrase that you see repeatedly in the teaching of the council and in Paul VI. And I think that someone like Pope Francis is very much shaped by that context, right? I mean, this is the same time. Interestingly, he's the first Pope we've had since Pius XII who was not either at or who was not at the council itself, right? I mean, so since John the 23rd, of course, summoned the council until Benedict XVI, we had that long succession of many decades of popes who were intimately involved with and at the council. He's the first pope we've had now who didn't have that kind of central role, but of course it's the time in which he's in Jesuit formation, the time in which he's this period coming out of the council in the 60s and into the 70s when he's a young Jesuit priest. He's actually quite young, made the provincial superior of the Jesuits in Argentina. And so I think he's shaped by this kind of Paul VI informed view of church governance, by the role of the synod in deliberating about issues facing the church. And I think then, and then continuing from that to the Popular Progressio, which is where I started talking about this, in 1967, also focusing very squarely on economic issues as part of a larger tapestry of the church's engagement in the the political and social life of the world. I mean, I was, for this session of my seminar that I had a couple weeks ago, and rereading Populo and Progressio, I was again just impressed by the incisiveness with which Paul VI engaged these questions of international economic development, and the way in which the teaching on the family, with which I was talking just a moment ago, is connected to issues of economic justice, which is also another theme that you get in this document. Again, not so much the focus of the contentiousness that people have been commenting on so much, but a lot of passages talking about challenges that families face with regard to financial difficulty, the crushing poverty that many face in parts of the world, and how that has an effect on family life, understandably. And so I think there's a kind of nice kind of combination of concern about the family, but not just in the abstract, which perhaps was somewhat the danger. I think one wouldn't want to overstate this, but perhaps not an abstract concern with the family as a kind of political ideal or something like that you might have had in earlier papal teaching, but really focusing on the contemporary economic environment, the way in which the family in different parts of the world is encountered, which I think is very much part of the emphasis of the synodal process, so that you get bishops and representatives, I mean they have lay representatives too, but primarily bishops from all corners of the world to come and deliberate about this. Of course, much of the, as we saw played out in the media, much of the controversy of the synod was generated by some of these geographic differences, right? Bishops from some parts of the world, notably Western Europe, especially Germany, who perceived the challenges to the family in one way and were arguing for liberalization of certain doctrines of the church, and then bishops from other parts of the world, notably Africa, parts of Asia, the American bishops to some extent, who perceived different problems and didn't think that a doctrinal or disciplinary change was actually, thought that was actually a much less important issue to be focusing on than the issues that they were trying to emphasize. We can talk more about that as we engage it, but I just thought it was an interesting way in which the spirit of Paul VI lives on very much so, I think, in someone like Pope Francis, who I think, for understandable reasons, was very much shaped by that period in the recent church history. And then finally, I just want to make a few points, since I'm a law professor and lawyer, about maybe some ways in which, in this contested political season, we might think about these issues that the Pope Francis is raising for us in a document such as this. And at least in a few areas, I think the document speaks to us. Of course, one of the things that the document is always emphasized, and I think this is helpful, the references to Aquinas, which are few but important in the document, are at least in a few places very much focused on the point that Aquinas makes in the Treatise on Law, and also in some other places in the Summa, about the difficulty of descending into particulars and how there has to be variation in how one descends from abstract principles into the resolution of particular situations and cases. And of course, that's been a focus of a lot of the controversy coming at the document, because there's I think probably intentional ambiguity or lack of precision in the document about what this means for people in particularly difficult canonical situations with regard to marriages or cohabitation and so on. And that also applies to the discussion of what the legal or policy import of a document like this is. I think that it doesn't really call, for, other than a few things that it says are very bad, it doesn't really call for particular kind of legislative or policy solutions. But I think that in a general way, it encourages us to think about those. And I mentioned just three that I was throughout there. One is, of course, but marriage itself, right? How should law and policy encourage marriage? How should it make marriage something that is more better rooted in the legal and political culture of society? And of course, there's a lot one could say about that. There's an emphasis, interestingly, in the document at a few places on education and the importance of education, both the family as the place, of course, in which children are primarily educated initially, but also about ways in which education is at the service of flourishing family life, which in turn is in service of the common good, which is a very consistent theme in the social doctrine of the church. And so we might think there as well, given all the troubles that one can readily see in our education system, how we might think about that. And then there's a very interesting and important paragraph on adoption. Adoption is something that really only since John Paul II, who had some statements about adoption in some of his writings, adoption has I think come more to the fore as I wouldn't say a theme or an overriding concern or anything like that, but has started to be something that you see coming up more often in Catholic social teaching. I think part of that, of course, is in a response to the widespread legalization of abortion in many parts of the world. But he has this discussion of adoption in one of the paragraphs of the document. And I always come back to the question of how in what ways we might make adoption easier for those who both want to place children into adoption and those who want to adopt. And again, he doesn't sort of spell out any policy specifics on this, but I think it should raise those kinds of questions for us, because of course much of the contemporary crisis of family life that the document talks about is children who are abandoned, children who are raised in destitute poverty, children who don't have stable family life, and I think the question of adoption and other ways in which children can be rescued from these situations is one thing that I think deserves ongoing attention. So those are some general themes that I took away from the document, and we're happy to talk about those or anything else people are interested in.
Yeah, so I've heard it said by people who work in marriage prep that Chapter 4 should replace sort of current. Well, I don't work in marriage prep, but should replace current pamphlets that are out there, for sure. I think the whole document, if it weren't so long, should have more of a role to play in parish life. And I do think that's a cause for concern, the length of the document, honestly, for a pope who has such pastoral impulses and wants to speak directly to as many people as possible. There's just not a lot of people who are willing to take that time, and then that causes the problem that then these documents are filtered through the media, which I think is just radically unhelpful. So absolutely, in particular, Chapter 4, maybe 4 and 5, maybe 2 and 6 also.
And this is another abstract generalizations and then particulars where he does. There are some sections on marriage prep. There's one in particular I remember reading with interest, and he talks about the role of the church in preparing couples for marriage, and the role of parish priests and ministers of the church in preparing couples for marriage. But he leaves, other than there's some, as I had an impression from reading those passages that there was a kind of call to re-engage this question, to rethink how the church does marriage prep, that it isn't all it might be. And I think for those of us who've gone through it or are peripherally see it going on in our parishes, I think that's right. I mean, I don't think that it's done particularly well or effectively. You're sitting next to a friend of mine who's in formation for the Augustinian order, and he's going through years of discernment and preparation and spiritual direction and education to take vows as an Augustinian, and the church treats, quite by comparison, and quite cavalierly, preparation for marriage, right? And I'm not saying that we should make married couples go through 5 years of marriage prep, although it might not hurt. But it is something where I think the document calls for that, but doesn't go into particulars about it. But at least, and again, in some ways, it's what the synodal process is supposed to do, right? Is that the Pope hears these concerns, issues this apostolic exhortation now, which is meant to exhort, right, the church, not only the bishops and the clergy, but the laity as well, to rethink these questions. And so that has to happen at the parish level and at the local level. But I do think that it's an area that, as the document itself suggests, needs hard examination. In the modern era, yes, it was coming out of Apostolic Solicitudo that the modern iteration of the Synod of Bishops began. This is kind of typical kind of Vatican II kind of insight, though, but the idea, at least at its best, is an ancient idea, right? That there would be gatherings of the bishops with the Pope as their head to deliberate about issues facing the Church, and of course that's a long-standing tradition. And so on the more particular point, this is obviously a lot of the controversy of the document is how much of what the Pope says with regard to the authority of local bishops is meant to be going in the direction that you're indicating. He has one point he makes is about annulments, and he reiterates something that he said so he issued, before this apostolic exhortation, he issued a letter in which there were changes to canon law, or to provisions of the implementation of canon law with regard to the processing and conditions for annulment that placed very squarely at least in certain cases, the approval of annulments in the hands of the local bishop. And so that was one move, and he reiterates that in this document. He says one of the concerns that he heard coming out of this process was the difficulties that people encountered and the delays that people faced in seeking declarations of annulment, and the part of the reform of canon law and its implementation in this regard, and letting bishops make a decision in these cases more quickly was in response to that. And so that's one way in which local bishops have been empowered in a certain sense with regard to these cases. Now, whether a lot more rides on, or I don't know if a lot more, but doctrinally and more controversially has been implications people have or tried to draw or are trying to draw with regard to the differential treatment of those who are in canonically invalid second marriages after divorce. And the document, as I said, is intentionally, I think, unclear on that, right? It never comes out and says anything like what you'd indicated, that now it's up to local bishops to basically make up their decisions on this. And there are passages that affirm very strongly the Church's doctrine on indissolubility of marriage. And I should say, this is a sort of an ecclesiological footnote, that in an apostolic exhortation, I think there are serious questions about whether there could be any kind of announced change in doctrine in an apostolic exhortation, as opposed to something at a higher level of formality, like an encyclical letter or the like. But there are actually just a couple footnotes and some passages in it that talk about the sacraments, and it's actually not clear whether it's in reference to reconciliation or the Eucharist as an aid to bringing people, reconciling people in these difficult situations. There's a lot of discussion of mercy in this Jubilee year of mercy that are clearly meant to suggest that the Church needs to rethink how it approaches those in these difficult situations. And that's where it stands, right? And that's been, as I said, throughout, that's been a lot of the focus on those who, on the more conservative side, who expressed grave misgivings about some of those parts of the document and what they're meant to imply, and then, of course, those on a more liberal side who are rushing to kind of, in some cases, I think, kind of over-interpret them as opening the door to this. And the document, I think, is hard to kind of read on this.
Can I just add something? I think it might be that the sentence that you're referring to comes out of chapter 1, where the Pope says something like, not all questions will be determined by the magisterium. There's some questions. So it's not that he's throwing open the doors, decision-making in the areas of family life to bishops solely. But there's a recognition, as there has been throughout this pontificate, that, and actually, not just in the pontificate, but in the synodal process itself, that different dioceses face radically different challenges, right? Just radically different. So in Sweden, 2% of the population is Catholic. In Uganda, it's 45%. We've got areas of the church where the church is growing where polygamy is a big issue, right? I mean, there's just a recognition that the challenges of modern family life are placed on a radically varied landscape. But I agree with everything Mike said, that that's not to say then that the decisions are going to be, that he sort of throws open the doors. I think the intentional vagueness of it, in particular footnote 351, is wise in a way that, Nostra Aetate is intentionally vague in places too. There are Vatican II documents all over the place were intentionally vague because there was a recognition at Vatican II that the bishops had not come to an agreement about certain theological issues, and so the words were very carefully chosen. Now, when you're dealing with documents from Vatican II, you're dealing with words that were deliberated over the course of 3 years with 2,000 bishops, and the teaching authority of those documents is much higher, in my estimation, not just in the Church's estimation, than an apostolic exhortation.
Actually, I didn't want to take up too much time, but I thought about also you could kind of have a progression of looking back at Paul VI from Apostolic Exhortation to Popular and Progressio to Humanae Vitae, which of course is the last encyclical that Paul VI issued, partly because he was so upset, I gather, by the kind of reaction to it. But Francis, and it's again it's somewhat confounding for people who kind of want to overread Pope Francis in one direction or another, that he actually has been quite clear in his support. Makes it sound like a political position like that, but he has in spoken statements talked about Humanae Vitae as an important social encyclical of the Church. Interesting use of the word social encyclical of the Church. Never calling into doubt the teaching on artificial contraception, and he does it in this document as well. He reaffirms the teaching of Humanae Vitae in crystal clear terms. Also, the teaching of Humanae Vitae with regard to regulation of the size of families, which Humanae Vitae mentions, so does Popular and Progressio, and he mentions it again here. But with the leaving fully intact the Church's teaching with regard to artificial contraception. So, and that and notwithstanding the arguments of some in the synodal process in with regard to trying to revisit that question, that there's really been no, at least as I've seen, no kind of openness to that on the part of Pope Francis. I mean, the German bishops, especially Cardinal Casper, obviously were in this. There's a long process in which this was played out. We're very much in favor of a revisiting of the teaching with regard to communion for the divorced and remarried, but not on contraception. Peter Steinfels actually had a piece in Commonweal in which, Steinfels is a leading American Catholic of, I think generally one would say kind of the left, who said contraception's the big issue that the Synod won't is not discussing and took off the table, and saying this from a perspective that wants that to be a source of ongoing debate within the church, and the synod and Francis at the head of it seemed to have no time for that. It's a larger point I often make about Pope Francis is, biography is important for understanding figures like him. And if you think that Benedict XVI was a theology professor and then a bishop, John Paul II was a philosophy professor and then a bishop, and then some of the prior popes before that were Vatican diplomats or the like. And Francis, in his most formative period of his professional life, was a spiritual director, right? After his convulsive, difficult time as provincial superior of the Jesuits, he sort of sent out, he falls out with his Jesuit brothers and goes out to Cordoba, which is kind of like going out to, I don't know, Kansas City or something, and is a spiritual director for several years, and so he's not a professor, right? He's a spiritual director for these formative years. And what do spiritual directors do? They work with their directees in discerning the particulars of God's movement in a person's life, right? And so there's always this kind of this subtlety in him of trying to figure out what's going on in a particular situation. It results in a different kind of mode of teaching and of expression than one would get from, say, a theologian, right, or a philosophy professor. And I think that's been some of the frustration with Francis, is that he's so often kind of reacting to the moment, right? These calls that he makes to people and the things he says to people in individual situations. But that's kind of what if you've been in spiritual direction, that's kind of what spiritual directors do, right? That's the whole point of spiritual direction. And so now we have a spiritual director as Pope, right?
So it emerges out of the synodal process. So generally, a pope will call a synod. The pope will decide what the synod is about, call the bishops. This was a 2-year synod. And then generally about a year after the close of the synod, the pope will issue an apostolic exhortation. So it's just part of this process.
Okay, so that's common then.
It's absolutely common.
Not issue an encyclical. Okay.
Exactly.
Right, and there's and I'm not an expert in ecclesiology to this extent, but there's a whole literature about different weights and notes that one attaches to statements of doctrine. So an apostolic exhortation, though, and there have been prior ones on the family, actually, Familiaris Consortio by John Paul II, which also came out of an earlier synod on the family, are meant, as I said earlier, meant to kind of exhort people. They're meant to kind of give charge, if you will, to the church with regard to particular issues, and are not meant, as say an encyclical or certainly like an apostolic constitution at a council, are not meant to be declarative statements with regard to the status of a particular question in church doctrine, which of course doesn't stop people from kind of fly-specking them and figuring out what particular footnotes mean and the direction which the apostolic exhortation is suggesting. But I think there is something to the whole point that this is not meant to be a kind of settled statement of doctrine on these contested questions, but is instead meant to be reflective of the synodal process itself.
No, for sure it's true. So what I said about ontology is that the moment you're on the altar and you say those words of consent, you're changed. You don't get it. You don't think about it. You think about it, a lot of other things, but you're changed. That's the words mean are symbolic, have sacramental significance beyond what you understand, right? And over the years of the married life together, you come to understand those words, both through the joyous moments, but perhaps primarily through enduring the real challenges together, you know. And the challenges look differently in year 1 than they do at year 10, or I imagine at year 20, right? I do think that at least I'll speak personally for us, over the course of the 16, it has definitely progressively gotten better, not in sort of this linear, progressive, modernist, historical sense, right? But year 1 sucked. I mean, honestly, it was just, remember, I was convinced we were going to get a divorce. Because it was like, who was this guy, and why was he living this way, and why was I living with him? Because he was such a slob, you know? I mean, that's just how it was.
And still a slob.
Still a slob, that's right.
Or tolerant.
She's been sanctified.
No, I really remember, and you use the word, and it's amazing how powerful words are, because you use the word divorce, and it becomes a possible reality. In a way that if you have to tutor yourself to not even say the word. I think there's a power to the language that you use when you're arguing, when you're not, you know, when you're loving, all of it. The words have significance beyond what you got to sort of pay attention. I don't know, do you have anything to say?
No, I agree with all that. And one of the things I was thinking about from a personal standpoint in our own marriage was that I was recalled to by this document. He talks a lot about the parish and the place of the larger church and community in the life of a couple, and it caused me to think back to the different struggles we've had as a couple, but how different I'm not articulating this very well, but different ways of being in a Catholic setting. And for our first 2 years of marriage, we were living in Ann Arbor, and Anna was the education director for the Catholic campus ministry at the Newman Center at the University of Michigan. And so we were really too well integrated into into this life of this parish. But it was, in a way, it was providential, right? I mean, because it meant that we were surrounded by a lot of other examples of holiness, both single people and married people, and it meant that we were part of this really loving Catholic community as a couple, which inevitably I think the first few years of marriage are challenging. I mean, as Anna would be quick to say, I went to all boys high school and then Notre Dame, which is single-sex dorms, and so dealing with women was not kind of part of my formative life, right? And thank God we had the grace of the sacraments at St. Mary's Student Parish at Ann Arbor to get us through it.
I can see it. It's at the top of the page. About the spouse who is not Catholic being, the word is not sanctified, it's better than that, but being kind of not brought in, and that's not the right word either, but that the link, sort of the Catholic spouse really links the non-Catholic spouse to this whole vision of Catholic married life and family life in a transformative way, in a way that is true for both of them. I'm totally not saying it right, but it's at the top of one of the 268. And yes, you should read it because it's there. I know it's there.
And it does talk about roughly that paragraph or right around it, talk about the challenge of a non-Catholic spouse being not able to come to the Eucharist and all that, and it's reflective to me of what, at least at its best, the synodal process is supposed to do, right? So the Pope, or those who are drafting this document, heard from a lot of bishops that this is a big issue out there, right? That lots of Catholics are marrying non-Catholics, and so this is a pastoral challenge in the parishes and in the dioceses to address these concerns about how does the church think about this? How should you approach it in a way that gives pastorally applicable advice, and not just kind of pretend that that it's not an issue.
Yeah, I mean, amen, brother. That's true.
Yeah, and the earlier point about the concern in the document about the over-idealization of family life, and some paragraphs in which he talks about the challenge of aging, the crises that either all the way up to and including the death of a spouse, but different kinds of crises in the life of a family. So I think he wants to turn down the volume on that kind of idealization of what family life can be, and it comes back to the point about marriage preparation in some ways as well, that marriage preparation and the church's teaching and reflection on marriage should not paint this kind of utopian view of what marriage and family life is like, and then leave to pastoral application how one kind of addresses these issues.
Let me just also add that I do think that one of the particularly toxic elements in our culture is what's in the air we breathe, this option for divorce. So that it's not just that you're going through a rough time, but you're going through a rough time, and how rough is it, and is it enough to close the door? And all these sort of added elements are just part of our culture, instead of kind of thinking of it as a life sentence, and you're in it for the long haul. Mike and I used to say at the beginning of our marriage, like, murder's on the table, divorce is not, right? So, like, if it's so bad, like, you can kill the other person. So, that's how bad it has to get, is you have to actually murder the other person. That seems to be like a healthy framework within which to at married life. Excellent point.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important that the people read the document, which again I think the document itself does a disservice by being so long and I think unnecessarily diffuse in places. So that people read the document and incorporate it into how they, as Catholics generally, but certainly those in positions of leadership in the church, how they think about these issues, and you're right, and then the teaching will either be received, or the points of emphasis and such will either be received or not. And that of course is part of the challenge that came up in the synod itself, was that some of the bishops wanted to have a conversation focused on A, and others wanted to have a conversation focused on B. And they didn't. The problem that the others were seeing, they didn't see in their own dioceses, and that I think caused unnecessarily, and I think partly because there was an agenda on the part of some at the synod to kind of sow this kind of free for all feel that the synod had in some ways at certain points, that I think make the challenge all the more difficult.
And yet it was a very Jesuit framework, too, of just kind of, just let it go, right? So procedurally, no, right? Because the Apostolic Exhortation does not grant power to individual priests. But I'll also say that I said it in Lumen Christi events in the past, but I'm just going to have to repeat it because I do think it's important. and it supports what Mike said about biography is important here, that this Pope Francis comes from a very traditional Catholic context, in which that footnote in which he says, it's a quote from Evangelium Gaudium, in which he says that the confession, don't treat the confession like a torture chamber. Like, have any of you ever had a confessional experience okay, so I'm talking about young people, in the post-Vatican II, in the confessional, that was an experience anything remotely similar to a torture chamber, right? No, of course not. My only experience of that was in Argentina. I mean, and I'm serious. I mean, it's just, he comes from so when he says, the line about conscience, where he writes, we should form consciences, not replace them. I'm like, when has from a North American perspective, when has a priest tried to replace my conscience in my upbringing in this country? That's not the Catholic context out of which we are, sort of out of which I've been raised in this country, but it is the context out of which the Pope has been raised, and in many, I mean, of course, the social situation and the ecclesial situation in Argentina has collapsed pretty radically quickly, but in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the ecclesial context was a very socially, ecclesially, and culturally conservative one.
And there's this emphasis on conscience, which I don't even know if I'd say it's an emphasis in the document, but there are passages or lines. Part of the problem, there's a long-standing kind of teaching about the primacy of conscience, but it was in a larger framework in Aquinas or someone like John Henry Newman. It was part of a larger framework of understanding moral formation and the like. And I think in our setting, certainly in North American setting, this language of individual conscience and long-standing teachings of the church that you get in someone like Aquinas, that one should always follow one's conscience, it doesn't have that context, and so it seems to be a kind of everything's up for grabs, which of course is not the point of this document, or of the moral tradition of Catholicism more generally. But there's a danger of that language getting sort of distorted, I think, that one should always be attentive to. And it goes back to the point about forming conscience. So one should always follow one's conscience, but one also has obligations of forming one's conscience. And part of that is understanding and engaging with the teachings of the church and so forth. So that while one should always follow one's conscience, one can have an erroneous conscience, right? One can either be culpable or not in how one's conscience is in error, and that's what, when he mentions that, and is of course right, he's thinking back to or conjuring up a particular way in which in the confessional or otherwise the church didn't have any kind of robust idea of people having a conscience or having obligations of forming their conscience. But again, that certainly post, 1960 or so, that has not been the lived experience of Catholics.
That's actually a good example, because Mike and I have very different understandings of the travel dispensation when going to Mass. So Mike basically thinks you have to be in an airplane for 24 hours with absolutely no possible access to a church, right? That would be the travel dispensation. I was formed by the Jesuits, and I think if you're traveling at any moment during the day, it might be cause for a travel dispensation. So that's a level of, I'm joking.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm kind of joking, but might be a little bit serious. So that's a situation in which we both take the obligation to go to Mass on Sunday seriously. But Mike takes it, in my estimation, to an insane extent, such that if we're driving across the country with our children, he will have me on like mass.com, and we'll stop, and the kids will be really poorly behaved because they've been in a car for 7 hours and they've got 3 more to go, and we're fulfilling our Mass obligation. Do you see what I mean? So that's a different, so you might agree with Mike, but I think I might have an argument to make that God would be okay if we're driving for 10 hours to take a travel dispensation.
So my example was just an example, and it's really
For
not
sure.
a question. So, and I don't know, I don't know, I've never researched what conscience means and satisfying our conscience. So is it church teaching that our conscience, or we can utilize our conscience depending upon the, as you call it, the specificity? So that the doctrine, I mean, again, I'm just not understanding this concept.
I think that would, so, the basic, the term itself just, it says, knowledge, right? Ciencia, right? Not knowledge with. And as John Finnis says in a paper on conscience, he says, you almost never have occasion to refer to your conscience, right? So you don't usually say, well, my conscience, I wanted to do this, but my conscience told me otherwise. There's just the question, what are you going to do, right? There's just a question of kind of practical decision making about what the right thing to do in a particular circumstance is. And then we theorize that as a kind of moral knowledge that the term conscience is meant to denote. And then it gets into the question then of how, you're right, I mean, how one forms one's conscience, and there are certain basic things. This is from Aquinas, right? There's a kind of, we know very basically certain things that are always wrong, or that would be contrary to our good, and then you descend into levels of particularity. But as Catholics, the position of the Church would be on this question would be that a well-formed conscience means one that is willing to submit itself to the teaching of the Church on a whole range of issues, one of which would include obligations that we have to attend Mass on Sunday, which are not subject to a generalizable traveler's dispensation, but are instead, especially with masstimes.org, available on everyone's iPhone, mean that you should make every effort one possibly can to fulfill that obligation, and then there are particular exceptions to that. I mean, so the pair to conscience, I would say, in some respects, is prudence, right? How one understands in particular cases what is to be done, given the moral knowledge one has about what goods are to be pursued and what evils to be avoided, and then you descend down to particulars in particular cases.